Hello, everybody. This is Marta Gider-Pikarska. I'm Director of Ecosystem for Hyperledger. And today we will hear a webinar from Chainyard about their very interesting case study on Trust Your Supplier. So let me share the screen with you, and we will go quickly through some basic housekeeping rules, and then we will let Gary start. We operate under antitrust policy. Please go read the full antitrust policy. Basically, do not share anything that should be confidential on this channels because they're open. This session is being recorded. Upon your request, we can share the slides with you. Just email membership@hyperledger.org. When you have questions, raise your hand or use the Q&A. Chat is for talking to the participants. So here we go. Gary, you can start sharing your screen, and I'm really looking forward to your talk.
Hi, I'm Gary Storr. I'm with, as Marta said, I'm with Chainyard, and we're going to talk here for a few minutes today around Trust Your Supplier, which is a, as you might have seen in the introduction, it's a trusted source of supplier information, and it's really a digital passport based on a blockchain network for purposes of connecting buyers and suppliers and partnerships across that blockchain network. So just a little bit of background about Chainyard. We are a blockchain consulting services organization. This is our first commercial product. We've done this in cooperation and in partnership with IBM. So obviously we're using IBM technology, and all the underlying infrastructure is part of IBM, as well as IBM as a partner has helped us with drafting the ecosystem and bringing the consortium members together with regard to the network. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward. But I think it's important to understand that what you're going to see here today, what I'm going to share with you is a product of both the efforts of Chainyard and IBM. So we'll see if we can move these charts forward. For whatever reason, it's not moving. Okay. So again, I see some, I apologize. I see some characters on the screen I'm not familiar with, but anyway, again, this is all about a partnership between IBM and Chainyard. IBM bringing that technology, the underlying blockchain technology, along with their procurement and source to pay experience, and then of course Chainyard bringing our technology expertise in blockchain to bear with regard to the solution. I'm not sure what quite's going on with the slides. Let me see if I can correct that. Mm-hmm. I assume everyone else is seeing some
yeah, Gary, can you take it off of display and see if
yeah, that's something's going on here.
We're having some.
Well, I'll just talk to it. I mean, you know, maybe I can read this hieroglyphics. So why I guess the first question for this team is why use blockchain? Why is blockchain important for this kind of solution? So again, the solution is really about bringing together partnerships and trusted partnerships. And so what better way to do that with a solution that's designed for trust, and that's blockchain. We all know about conventional databases and systems, and certainly, you know, there's still a healthy place for those in the marketplace, and we utilize many conventional technologies underneath our Trust Your Supplier application infrastructure, but blockchain really becomes the core of that trusted, common, single version of the truth that all of our network constituents are looking for. So by enabling blockchain, what we allow to do is all of our constituents in the network, number one, they have the option for a node ownership. Number two is that information obviously is going to become immutable and provides all of the audit, the capability, and the encryption capability that comes with a Hyperledger backbone. And it enables us to to become a network of networks, if you will. So there's been a lot written about that, as I'm sure everyone here knows, and we're beginning to practice that. So our blockchain network, it will be at some point connected with other blockchain networks, to the extent that we can get transactional pieces of networks glued together from an underlying blockchain technology perspective. That's going to drive future opportunities. And the core capability that we're really providing on our Trust Your Supplier network is all about supplier identity. And that digital identity existing in a blockchain. We talked a couple of months ago, I think, on this platform. We did talk about a DID, a digital identifier. It said digital identifier is then embedded in our blockchain solution and in our supplier identity. So that supplier identity can then be ported from network to network and buyer to buyer and partner to partner as kind of their trusted and common passport, if you will, into other networks and into buyer and partnership arrangements. Today in supplier information management, what we see today is we have a lot of especially today, with everything that's going on in the world, with the situation with the pandemic, it's more important than ever that we have trust in our partnerships. And today the process is very convoluted. It's highly manual. We're devoid of standards. We don't have a lot of technology today that helps us identify trust with regard to the partners and the suppliers that we use in delivering business. And so what Trust Your Supplier is all about is exactly that, it's delivering on that by using technologies like blockchain and using that trusted digital identity I talked about a minute ago, such that the buyers can then look to that identity and very quickly make business decisions about if they want to do business with that particular supplier. So this slide is, and I'm not going to, in the interest of time, this is a video, and when it's distributed later, you can take a look at it. We'll go to the next slide. So just to detail some of the challenges today, right? So qualification, it's really difficult to identify a supplier today. There's a lot of fraud in the world, especially in, we've seen examples of that if you've been paying attention to the news with things like procuring PPE, a load of fraud that's happening today with suppliers, bad actors, misidentifying themselves and their product to the marketplace. And so as a consequence, trust is very difficult to obtain. It's hard to discover and just identify those quality suppliers. And that leads to a very slow and efficient process. So suppliers are in a situation today where they're providing, to qualify, they're supplying information over and over again from buyer to buyer to buyer to buyer. We're a small business ourselves in Chainyard, so the organizations that we do business with, we go through this every day. We're sent questionnaires in Excel and PDFs in Word format, and we have to answer essentially the same questions over and over and over and over again. And that's part of a qualification process and a validation process. And so what we're then forced to do is staff that repetitive process, and it's very painful and it's very inefficient and it's not very cost effective. So what our platform does is allows a supplier to establish a digital identity on a platform one time that can then be broadcast to any buyer that seeks business with us, and then that identity becomes immediately consumable by that supplier or that buyer, and then that buyer can then start to make business decisions. Right. So, and that goes to validation. So validation is very cumbersome today. Many buyers reach out to third-party verifiers on a manual basis to supplement supplier information and to also look at what verify information that suppliers provided. So as an example, financial information, we might reach out to an organization like Dun & Bradstreet or Thomson Reuters, Dow Jones, what have you, to verify information that the supplier is providing about their financial performance historically. That process is very manual today by the buyer. They have to log into a different system. They may have to look at a different PDF. They have to do a stare and compare between what the suppliers provided and what that organization, that third-party organization, is offering. And so certainly that's very difficult and time-consuming, costly, and it gives very limited access to all of the history that's associated with that supplier. And then when we move to onboarding, there's limited integration with the ERP systems that the buyer happens to be using. So then that supplier information needs to be rekeyed. So there's a lot of duplication of effort on the buyer side to now populate their vendor master with that supplier information. And then in terms of lifecycle management, there's just not a lot of updates from the supplier. So the supplier looks like, has a snapshot of what they look like today. That's very likely to change over time. And so buyers aren't very good at acquiring that updated supplier information. So if a supplier changes leadership, or if they change some of their product offerings, or perhaps some of their security profiles change around their IT architecture, those things change, the buyers don't have line of sight into that. So what we've tried to build here is technology to address all of those challenges. So here's kind of a depiction of what that looks like. And on the previous slide, I talked about how we had this slow and efficient process. So many of the buyers that we work with today in their procurement life cycle is somewhere in the 30 to 60 day range. What that means is between first contact with a supplier and a time that business actually occurs, a transaction actually occurs, could be 2 months. And that's, you know, in today's world where agility is key and speed is currency, that's just too long. And so those siloed systems limit availability to real-time data. There's an inability, as we talked about previously, to understand information about a supplier and make decisions quickly. And so as a result, there is a lot of manual activity that has to occur, a lot of back and forth that needs to occur, and all this is extremely time consuming. And so you can see that changes are happening continuously, and there's multiple versions of the truth, in that the supplier has to answer these questionnaires over and over and over again to the same buyer, or to duplicate buyers, or to different buyers. And this information is moving via very conventional means, whether it be an email or a phone call or some kind of attachment in an email, which is highly insecure, as we all know. And this is very delicate information. So we've got a very inefficient process that does not at all align to any kind of privacy or security protocols that are commonplace today. And then it's just a very time-consuming, inefficient process that, frankly, attracts cost and impacts the bottom line of both the supplier and the buyer. So, you know, again, these are the kind of challenges that exist in the marketplace today, and those were the very things that our solution was targeting. So what Trust Your Supplier really is its core. We talked a little bit about this when I introduced it. It is that digital identity, and it's all about accelerating that onboarding and lifecycle management for both the buyer and supplier. And so what we've seen just in early stages of deployment of the solution is up to 90% savings in updating supplier information. So what used to take 10 hours now takes 1 hour, as an example. So that means that a buyer today that spent 10 hours interfacing with a supplier to aggregate all of their information, to get all of their spreadsheets, to look at all of their third-party information from Dun & Bradstreet and Dow Jones and EcoVadis and Rapid Ratings and all of those kind of organizations, and to go through all of their category management and risk management silos within the organization to distribute that information, and then to collect that all back and make all the decisions associated with that process. If that process took 10 hours before, our technology has reduced that to about an hour's worth of time. That's really significant. And that means there's significant savings on the buyer side. And then likewise, suppliers are not being pinged on a repeated basis to supply information over and over again. By that information being on our blockchain, it's supplied just that single time. And so we also see a 70 to 90% reduction in cycle time. So those, not only are we reducing the analytical attraction of time, we're reducing the cycle time to get someone on board. So if it used to be 60 days to onboard a supplier, now we're seeing onboarding time in as short as 24 hours. We actually had, I mentioned IBM as our partner, so IBM is obviously using the solution, and we've seen them recently onboard suppliers in as little as 1 day. So this technology is already producing massive savings for them in that space. And if you think about what a supplier is going through in the their ability to load that digital identity and have that digital identity exist on the blockchain, now their attracted cost is minimized with that administrative overhead, and they can use that that energy now to focus on their core competencies, whatever it is they're providing. And then from a lifecycle management perspective, if the supplier keeps that information on their blockchain updated and in real time, the buyer can then consume that information whenever they need to consume it, so that they get an update. If the W-9 has changed, if their diversity supplier and diversity certification has changed, anything that's changed in their leadership profile, whatever it might be, and now instantly becomes available to the buyer, and the buyer can subscribe to notifications about changes of that sort. And so all of those things then become very, very easy for the supplier to administrate. And so if we look on the right hand of the slide, and this is really, I think, a good topology, a pictorial of how this network operates. There's multiple personas on this network. I've talked about the supplier and the buyer repeatedly here, and their value proposition, but there's also, I talked about how buyers today use like the Dun & Bradstreets, these third parties of the world. Well, those organizations are now on our blockchain. So that information that the buyer had to go seek out through external means, whether it was logging into a different portal or consulting maybe a PDF library that they had available, now that information exists on our blockchain. So when a buyer pulls up a supplier profile, they'll have a little block of information in that profile that says, Dun & Bradstreet, here's the here's the financial detail associated with that buyer. Or if they're interested in their sustainability, EcoVadis is on a network, and EcoVadis, if you don't know, provides sustainability and environmental rankings associated to suppliers. That information is now on our network and is easily aggregated on the blockchain, so that the buyers and suppliers both can see that very, very quickly and start to make decisions. Also, certificate issuers. Think about organizations like these are like diversity organizations as an example, that provide some form of certification around the supplier's diversity status, or perhaps this could be a certificate issue around a particular security or controls validations, like a SOC or a maybe some kind of niche or some kind of GDPR qualification that an organization might have. Auditor, these would be organizations like like a KPMG that does auditing. That typically an auditor comes into an organization, they have to go to the four corners of the of an organization to dig up all of the audit detail that's required. Now all of that information resides in one place, and that's on our blockchain. Business network providers. Just think about Ariba or Coupa, iValue. I think organizations like that interface from a procure to pay perspective. Well, trust your suppliers, digital identity can then be shared with those business network providers, so that information, that identity, can then be consumed and used for purposes downstream into their into the buyer's enterprise, whether it be procure to pay or in their master data governance record, downstream to their ERP with regard to supply chain concerns and things of that nature. And then lastly, third-party development. So we've got a marketplace on the network that allows third parties to develop applications and other use cases and contribute to the network in ways that perhaps we haven't really thought about or aren't, are our core competency. And those kind of capabilities can be brought to bear on the network through either APIs or direct integration on the network through network of networks enablement and things of that nature. These are the real benefits for buyers here, and buyers, we're talking about large enterprise organizations that have tens and sometimes hundreds of thousands of buyers. So this is a huge cost detractor for an organization, let's say like an IBM. And so when we talk about reduction, and you see some of the numbers here, but when we talk about this kind of reduction, this is hugely impactful. Organizations like IBM have literally billions of dollars to spend, and you can imagine the overhead associated with some of the traditional means of procurement and supplier qualification and lifecycle management that we talked about, and all the associated attracted cost, risk, and other concerns, inefficiencies that have attached themselves to those processes. Well, our technology just simplifies a great many of those challenges and minimizes all those risks and compliance exposures. And this is a real benefit for all of those organizations. And I'm going to talk about some of those and who they are in a minute. From a supplier perspective, again, I no longer have to develop, whether I'm a big supplier like IBM or a small supplier like Chainyard, I eliminate all that redundant activity that's associated with interfacing to every customer I might have. I'm filling out a profile one time and it's consumable on that blockchain to anybody that's on that blockchain. And that allows me to defocus on that administrative overhead and become part of a network that now I become discoverable by other parties on that network, and that enables new business opportunities for me as a supplier. So it's really a win-win for all the parties on the network, and that's really kind of the beauty of our solutions. I won't spend a lot of time here because we've talked a lot about this. We've talked a lot about buyers and suppliers. For our business networks and third-party developers, I mentioned, look, there's potential for integration for APIs to create new distribution channels, new marketplace opportunities, new business opportunities on our blockchain or by introducing things like network of networks and enhancing maybe some existing solutions that can use the digital identity of the supplier base. From an audit compliance perspective, that enables more robust reporting capability and enforcing that legal and regulatory framework that in today's enterprise environments are very difficult because of the fractured nature of where data exists and how supplier identity is and oversight is managed within these enterprises. It's very often done in internal systems and quite often fragmented through multiple systems where there is no singular version of the truth. And so our solution provides that. Likewise, with certificate issuers, this is that simplified base where all of those certificates can then be housed and then directly associated with a supplier. And as they're updated, they're available in real time. And so this allows simplification from those verifiers and certificate issuers to provide their information in one place. And it also provides additional business opportunities for those organizations in that we provide what we refer to as a baseline or freemium capability for all of these verifiers on the network, and then availability of for them to upsell premium or enhanced services on the network gives them line of sight to buyers and suppliers alike that could potentially be interested in purchasing some of those premium services. And then, in terms of trust, We've established a governance council. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But that governance board is then there to guide the evolution of the network and the product roadmap, and seed the network with a strong supplier base, and build the network through subject matter expertise and thought leadership, and then recruitment of additional members to the network. And then our role is, from a Chainyard perspective, we're the owner and operator. So we ensure we kind of turn the crank on the network every day to keep it operational, to evolve it, to ensure that we're continuing to use the latest and greatest technology, whether it be new capability within blockchain or something else, to oversee and ensure that we're driving that forward. So this is just an interesting example of some of the efficiencies that we've brought to bear. So in today's world, there's very often data and data that's very often captured in something like a questionnaire that helps identify the detail around the supplier's business, their ethics, their company operations, the kind of products they deal with, their history. And very often that's esoteric, kind of esoteric in terms of how customers interface with that, how buyers interface with that. Our approach really is to standardize that. And the way we've standardized that is by coming up with a generic set of questionnaires and data collection, a collection of data that is going to firmographically identify, be part of that identity for the supplier. And so we think about 50% of that is common across industries, across geographies, and across any kind of buyer. So we've taken what has been highly esoteric, and we've taken at least half of it, and we've put it into a common realm that exists on the blockchain. And then we can augment that maybe to the tune of 20-25% for a given industry. For example, some of the questions or some of the data you might collect if you're in the pharmaceutical industry might be very different than if you are in manufacturing electronics. So those deltas are captured, but on a much less esoteric basis than has traditionally been captured. Then you move into the geographic realm. So obviously some of the information that you might capture if you're looking at a supplier that's based in China could be very different than the supplier that's based in the United States or somewhere maybe in the West. And then of course there's always going to be some very specific data that you'll capture that's germane to the buyer itself. But we feel that that's a very, very small percentage, maybe significant, but still a very small percentage of the overall data hierarchy. So by using methodologies like this, and this is just an example, but I think you get the idea that we're able to take using the digital identity platform and force a lot of generic information so it becomes consumable in a standardized manner by constituents on the network without having a lot of that esoteric representation of data. And that's where the blockchain helps us a great deal. And I talked a little bit about ecosystem partners. I'm going to talk. So this all deal with supplier risks. So the reason that third parties are used by buyers is to minimize and define risk associated with their supplier base, right? So it's all about operational risks. What's the quality, security controls, what's the breach history if they have one, what's their disaster recovery planning, things like that. Compliance, is child labor an issue if they're dealing with conflict minerals, ethical practices, EPA standards and adherences, continuity around how they, with their employee base, what's their financial strength, things of that nature. Strategically, how well does the supplier line up with geopolitical constraints? Are they on embargoed lists? Have they, how do they deal with legal and regulatory concerns in their geo or in their business or in their industry? And then financially and commercially, how can they, how do they deal with their finances, right? How do they deal with their billing? What are their terms? How do they deal with conventional trade practices? So all this is provided by both the supplier and third parties. And these third parties, like banks, like Ecovatus, like Dun & Bradstreet, for example, they help minimize and expose risk with associated suppliers. And then you can see that drives trust, right? Trust with the validators, organizations that rate, organizations that provide certification, and then the auditors that we talked about. So all of this really brings together an ecosystem of trust so that supplier information is sovereign, it's provided by the supplier, but then it's validated, vetted, augmented, supplemented, and verified then by trusted partners on the network that specializes in these particular areas of risk. And we'll probably finish up here because I want to leave a little bit of time for questions. So these are our board of governors, and you see some, I'm sure, some very recognizable logos here. We've got, again, some substantial players on the network. Our approach has been to try to group try to find a leadership in each one of the industries that you see here, anywhere from, aerospace on through to consumer, logistics, et cetera, that you see here on the slide. And these are the leaders, very recognizable, very powerful players in these given industries. And our idea is we're going to seed the network with suppliers from these large organizations and enterprises, and then they'll in turn invite organizations that are perhaps competitors or partners in those industries to help build out those industries vertically, so that we have a capture of a market share in particular industries, and that we're capturing the supplier base in those industries as well. And then you can see in the bottom of this slide some of the validators, some of the business networks, and some of the other buyers that have been or are in the process of onboarding to our network to contribute in some way. Okay, so again, really some substantial traction here. A lot of top of the food chain players are part of the network, and this has given us a tremendous amount of momentum as we've driven this network forward.
We have quite a few questions actually. So if you allow me, I'll start with the top. Ever considered LEIS as part of your verification data sources?
Well, we've considered a lot. So we have a pipeline of verification sources. To be honest with you, I'm not sure LEIS is on that list. There's a list of about 70 providers of third-party information. So it's a very robust list. Look, the intent of our network is to have a whole marketplace, a storefront, if you will, of different providers that a buyer and supplier can choose from to aggregate information and begin to use those as verification sources. So again, I don't know if LEIS is on there, but I'll take a note to take a look at that. But again, the intention is we want a whole host of third-party providers bringing their expertise to our network.
So now another question. How do you offer or package your company's platform to your customers? Was it on-prem or via cloud? And how do you handle, it's a combined question, how do you handle integration with their existing ERP system, and how much does it cost?
Yeah, so those are great questions. So it is a SaaS tool, so it's delivered on the cloud. And it's browser based. It's a subscription model, so suppliers currently pay for a subscription to the network, and right now those logos that you saw, we provide the service free to those buyers. In the future, other buyers, there'll be a subscription cost as well. With regard to integration to back-end systems like ERPs, we do that two ways. Really three ways. The first way is you could do it standalone. You don't have to integrate if you're a buyer, and we've got a couple of examples of buyers that don't integrate. Most, however, do want integration for obvious reasons into their back-end systems, and so that can be done with the standard API gateway that we've developed, and that supplier identity can then be consumed into downstream systems like your ERP or your MDG or MDM or your SLP or whatever it might be. And then The third way we could provide is custom integration. So several of our buyers have asked us to develop custom solutions to integrate to those parties' platforms. Now, in the future, perhaps, if there's ever, blockchain-based ERP, then, we'll have even a different way to go about architecturally integrating this digital identity with those back-end environments.
Great, thank you. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 questions to go through. So what is the strategy adopted for digital identity?
So digital identity so a couple of premises there. Number one, it was a strong philosophical principle that we wanted sovereignty on the supplier's data and supply it. So that meant the supplier needed to own the data. So the supplier owns, much like you and I own our own LinkedIn profile, the supplier owns their own Trust Your Supplier profile. So they provide all of the firmographic information, they provide all of the questionnaire detail, and they provide any other attached information, something like a W-9 or a certificate or whatever they might attach. All of that's provided by the supplier. That becomes part of that digital identity. And then we just augment it with those third-party providers that we talked about. So if they have a DUNS number and they have a Dun & Bradstreet report, then that becomes a supplement to that supplier's profile. Obviously, it's not sovereign because it's provided by a third party, but in aggregate, right, that supplemental information or that verified or that rating now becomes an adjunct to that supplier identity. And that holistically, from a buyer perspective, becomes part of the identity of what the supplier is and how the supplier will be judged and qualified in terms of whether they'll be onboarded.
Okay, so what challenges did you meet or foresee when trying to onboard suppliers and buyers to the platform as the platform is picking up?
Well, the biggest challenge with any business is marketing. It's a brand awareness. Now, we were fortunate to have a partner like IBM that's helped us a great deal. But regardless of what you're producing, what you're selling, what your offering might be, there has to be awareness in the marketplace. And so driving that awareness is sometimes that's not easy. So IBM was critical in bringing those logos to bear, and those logos that you saw, that all of those organizations have been very powerful in bringing that brand awareness around our tool and our solution. So I think that was certainly our biggest challenge. It was not a technology challenge. We did have a number of technology challenges, and still do, and I'm sure that as technology evolves, we will. But it's more in the business operations area that we're running into some of those commonplace challenges, and we take those on day by day, and as we grow and as we reach a tipping point, the network starts to create its own gravity. Maybe some of those challenges will move to the side and we'll be faced with others. But we've had a good ride so far.
Okay, I'm not sure that we'll be able to cover all those questions. So I guess I see a blog post coming up to address all of them. We will do our best. Do suppliers also own their own data?
They do. Yes. Again, that's a core principle. Suppliers own their own data. We don't touch their data. We don't manipulate their data. It's theirs.
Great. And what should be the rights of auditor in supply chain?
Well, that's a good question. I think that there's a lot of answers to that one that we probably don't have time to dig into. But really, an auditor, their role is going to be to use the information at hand to provide an evaluation, an objective evaluation about, whether it's a supplier or whether it's the performance of a supply chain or whether it's something regulatory, right? So our role in that is simply providing the information in a trusted, immutable platform, so it can be consumed and then processed by the auditor. So that's kind of where we leave that.
Great, thank you. So what is the minimum and maximum time to implement?
Well, the maximum time is probably, the longest time we've seen so far is probably been about 8 to 10 weeks. Depending, a lot of that is what level of integration you want on the back end, because if it's highly customized, obviously there's lead time associated with that. And some of that we do in phasing. You could be onboarded. We did a solution. I didn't talk a lot about it just because of time constraints, but we did a solution that was focused strictly on COVID, and we onboarded buyers inside of 24 hours. So it can be a very quick turnaround. Suppliers can come on board, and if they have information at hand, they can have the profile set up in less than 1 hour. We've seen suppliers do it in less than 1 hour, and buyers less than 1 day.
Thank you. So now we have a question. What challenges did you meet or foresee when trying to onboard suppliers and buyers to the platform, as the platform is picking up?
Well, there's a number of challenges. We talked a little bit about this in a previous question. One of the biggest challenges is of course, network awareness. As suppliers come on board, we're asking them to complete a profile, complete that firmographic information I talked about. Having that information available sometimes is a challenge for suppliers, and so they do require sometimes some lead time to perform those activities. And also there's a distinction between the information that a supplier that is a public company will provide vis-a-vis a private company. And those can be really sticky tripping points for a supplier as they complete the profile. So what we try to do is create a low level of impedance in terms of the kind of information the supplier is very comfortable in sharing or not sharing, and to give them a line of sight to creating a profile without violating any kind of internal concerns they might have with regard to the sovereignty of their information. And then on the buyer side, really, it's about the complexity of the enterprise. Many buyers are large organizations. Think about an organization the size of an IBM with 400,000 people. They have thousands of systems and tens of thousands of suppliers. These are real challenges. So we have to fit into sometimes their digital transformation plans, certain things like data security, concerns around information management are challenging. So it really requires at times a white glove treatment to bring large enterprises such as those onto the network, just to ensure that all of the attributes that they're looking for from a digital transformational solution, such as Trust Your Supplier, meets all of the requirements of their enterprise.
Wow, I didn't think it's that complicated. So actually we have a follow-up question to this one. If you could talk about what blockchain projects you used and the timeline you had for taking these platforms from whiteboard to going live.
Yeah, so we're a blockchain company, and so we have many concepts. We decided on supplier information management as kind of our where we thought we could deliver the most value and have maybe more of an immediate impact. And the fact that we had a partnership with IBM helped a great deal, because they were on the very same page that we were. So from the time that we began to whiteboard this solution to the time that we had a proof of concept was only about, I would say about 8 weeks, where we had a working proof of concept. And then we went from proof of concept to a solution that we could pilot with IBM in about 6 months' time. So that was a very quick process as well in terms of developing the technology. In fact, many of the longer lead time items, as we went from like whiteboard to production, had nothing at all to do with the technology, but were more commercial in nature, or perhaps some of the regulatory compliance concerns that you have when you launch a product such as this. So the technology went very smoothly and very quickly, and we continue to augment that. But You know, certainly if others are in the same boat in terms of looking to go from their whiteboarded technology, you know, my advice would be, you know, certainly focus on your core competency, which is your technology, but don't forget about some of the operational and commercial concerns you're going to have starting up.
Yeah, that is a very good point. So, what are the kind of the next steps? Do you foresee as a future of Trust of Your Supplier? Is it a finished product? Will you be adding more features to it?
Well, I don't think it's ever going to be a finished product. I think it's going to continue to evolve. The network, I always say that we need to get to the network to the point where it has its own gravity. We're not there yet. That tipping point is yet to be reached where the network just has such a compelling value proposition because of the constituencies on the network, whether it be buyers, suppliers, third parties, verifiers, certificate issuers, all those organizations and entities I talked about. As they continue to come on board and the network continues to grow and organically and becomes a network community, then we've reached that tipping point. But even when we reach that tipping point, we're going to see a continued evolution. The market's going to change. Technology is going to change. The way we do business is going to change. Certainly, the events of the last 3 or 4 months worldwide are going to impact in a large way, I think, just the way partnerships are formed. And the very definition of trust, I think, has changed just, you know, since the beginning of the year. And we've seen that with things like acquiring PPE, for example. So I don't think we're ever done. I think we're going to continue to evolve, but our next key milestone is again, get to that tipping point in which this network has, you know, kind of that organic base from which then it just kind of starts to self-fulfill itself.
Yeah. Well, that's very interesting. We have 2 more questions that I'll combine from Andy and from Matt. They're basically wanting to understand, how does your system architecture look like, the blockchain network and the everything that is between the blockchain network and the application and the data itself, and how can a developer get into your API economy?
That's an interesting question. So the technology is based on core underlying blockchain technology.
Gary, sorry, you cut out after "this is a very interesting question." So if you can start speaking again from just the answer.
Okay, starting. So that's a very interesting question. So our underlying technology is IBM IBP. As I think everyone is probably aware. And so, in fact, we just upgraded to IBP 2.0 a couple of weeks ago, and we're starting to leverage some of the new capabilities there. And in addition to that, you know, I mentioned before, because of requirements such as GDPR, we have a conventional offboard database, or off-chain database as referred to it, to handle PI, personal information data subjects. Our architecture also includes an API gateway structure that those can subscribe to, and we can provide that technical detail if anybody's interested, if they reach out to me. But there's an API gateway that can be revealed, and supplier identities can be consumed if you have the appropriate credentials. You would have to be a subscriber to the network in terms of a buyer to access that. And then if you're a third party interested in contributing to the network, I would ask you to reach out, and we'll have a sidebar conversation on that. The application itself is a Node.js platform, so it's browser based, and you know, it's kind of your garden variety SaaS solution. Currently, it's available from a desktop perspective, and we're working and should have at some juncture later this year a responsive version for mobile devices.
Great, thank you. So these are all the questions that we had from the participants. Is there anything that you'd like me to ask you?
That's always a loaded question. So Well, number one, I guess thanks to everybody for participating. This has been, a fantastic experience, and really, I know there's been a lot of participation here today. Maybe not so much a question, but just just in terms of sharing a little bit more information about Trust Your Supplier. We're here about establishing a network that's about partnerships. That's really the core of what we're trying to do. We're trying to establish a platform of identity such that partnerships can be formed. And we think that this is just going to be the core of the solution, and that other networks will emerge that we can build relationships with. And we think that the identities that we're establishing and that inherent partnership will help drive that network and network effect. And I think all of us in the blockchain community want to get to the point where our networks are highly interconnected and they do share information, and identities will be able to traverse those networks and those platforms. And so if you're into that, if you're doing it, then we love to hear from you, because that's what excites us, and that's really why we got into this in the first place.
Thank you, Gary. This was really interesting, and you did an amazing job. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Gary or Isaac. You have their email addresses here. In addition, I would like to announce that we have produced a case study with Chainyard, which has been published a couple of days ago. So if you are interested in learning more and reading more about their work, please follow the QR code or the link provided below. We also have more webinars coming. This is an ongoing effort where we will be recording webinars every 2 weeks. Next one will happen on June 17th from Milligan Partners, and then July 1st we will hear from Ben Taylor at Ledger Domain. If you are hungry for more, no worries, we have you covered. All of the recordings from Hyperledger Global Forum have been published on our Hyperledger YouTube channel, as well as you can download the presentations. Please get involved. We love more community and more involvement, so visit our chat, subscribe to our mailing list, or simply email us. We really want you to be involved.